Tá fáilte romh go léir ag an dara lécht speisialta seo chun comóra a dhéanamh bhreá níomh Columcille. Good evening and welcome to the second lecture in this series to commemorate the 15th centenary of the birth of St Columcille. My name is Alexander O'Hara. I'm the organizer of the series of lectures hosted by the Loyola Institute in partnership with our colleagues in Trinity College Library and Trinity Long Room Hub. The aim of this series is to combine scholarship and engagement from the fields of theology and medieval history in presenting Columcille in context. This evening's lecture will last about 40 minutes, and there will be time for discussion and Q&A afterwards. St Columba was the first in a series of ascetic exiles who left Ireland in the 6th century to pursue a voluntary form of religious exile known as Peregrinatio pro Christo, ascetic exile for the sake of Christ. The early Irish motif of Peregrinatio is best known from studies of Columba's namesake and younger contemporary Columbanus, who left Ireland in 590, a generation after Columcille. Assessments of the ascetic exile of Columcille and his network of monastic communities are complicated by a local historiography that at times struggles to dissect different causes of monastic travel and settlement. This evening's lecture by Professor Jonathan Wooding will examine a number of instances of ascetic exile in the Western Scottish and Atlantic Islands, from the 6th century, the time of Columcille himself, through to the 9th century, by which time Columban monks were making voyages to islands lying far to the north and northwest in the Atlantic Ocean and North Sea. We'll consider the different theological ideas that are found in the accounts of these journeys, as well as their implications for studies of settlement, including recent fieldwork being undertaken in Iceland. Jonathan Wooding was the Sir Warwick Fairfax Professor of Celtic Studies and is Honorary Professor in the Medieval and Early Modern Centre, University of Sydney. His research interests include narratives of travel in the early Celtic world, cults of voyaging saints, medieval otherworld tales, faith heritage, pilgrimage tourism, and modern secular monasticism. He has written or edited 16 books in the field of Celtic and insular studies, as well as many shorter contributions. His books and edited volumes include Living the Hours, Monastic Spirituality in Everyday Life, From the East to the Isles, Approaches to the Eastern Connections of the Early Churches of Britain and Ireland, Columba of Iona, Theologian, Lawmaker, Peacemaker, and The Otherworld Voyage in Early Irish Literature, an anthology of criticism. Professor Wooding, you are very welcome. We're just going to switch over now to Jonathan.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, thank you very much. And thank you for your very generous introduction, Alex, and also especially, can I say how honored I am to be participating in this lecture series and to contribute to, as you say, a conversation between historians and theologians, which is just exactly the sort of thing I feel like doing most of the time. I'll try now to just get my PowerPoint up and running, if you'll just give me a moment. And hang on, something's gone wrong with my picture here. Right on. We don't yet seem to have that coming through. Worked perfectly well in the rehearsal and now we can't find it, so hold on. I might have to start without Can you see what's wrong there, Alex?
If you go to the PowerPoint on your desktop,
Yeah,
and open that, and then go to share screen, and then click on the PowerPoint.
yeah, that's what I did. It doesn't seem to be working, but just
Maybe
try.
close out the PowerPoint.
Yeah, I'll try again. We'll just try reopening. As they always say, turn it off and on again. So hold on to see if we can get that started again. Right. It's like the lighted match. It worked well the first time. Yeah. Okay, we'll try that one more time now. Nope, still not working.
I'm going to try and get it up here, Jonathan.
Yeah, okay. This is worked when we rehearsed it earlier, and now it doesn't work. It's not showing on the desk on the link screen, so that's the problem.
Yeah, got it here. Okay. So. Okay, I'm just going to bring it up here now. Okay, can you see that, Jonathan?
Yeah, but can I advance that? That's going to be the only problem.
You just tell me when to switch slides.
Okay, it'd be like, I remember years ago when I was an undergraduate, there used to be a man at the back to advance the slide projector in the old days. So we'll just have to do it that way. Show must go on. Okay, well, first of all, a picture of Iona, just to get you in the mood. And my intention tonight particularly is to look at quite a long view of what I call the monastic family, the monastic familia of St Columcille, which, forgive me, I will call Columba the whole way through, because that's a name that always comes most easily to my lips. Okay, so Columba, Columcille, the same person. Right, can we go to slide 2 then, Alex, if that's all right? Yeah, thank you. Now, I just want to start by, first of all, saying anytime I talk about St Columba, I'm taken back to my very earliest days as a student, when 41 years ago, last month, I was an undergraduate at the University of Sydney, where I ended my career as well as starting it. And in a very cold May, which is getting towards winter on that side of the world, I sat down at the end of my first term to write my first large university essay, and it was going to be on Irish saints abroad in the Middle Ages. So I haven't traveled very far in my interests in that time. And I got out this beautiful green book, which I'll give you a picture of here. And it was laid out with this lovely arrangement with the Latin text generously on the left and the English on the right. And even the pages were a beautiful color. Now, I'd studied ancient history and modern history at school, but never studied medieval history. And encountering a book written in 700 or thereabouts AD was quite a shock. And yet this book was the most interesting book I think I ever read as a student, and probably the most interesting book I ever read in my whole scholarly career. So there's a plug for you. And anyone who hasn't opened The Life of St Columba by Adamnan has certainly missed something. This book took, this very inexperienced undergraduate on a journey of time travel, where I found myself sailing through the seas around the Hebridean Islands, alongside monks, maybe in little boats of wood or of hide, through the rough waters. The detail in this text alone is quite extraordinary. But it's also, in another sense, obviously, it's a hagiographical work. It's a work that is very challenging to read in terms of what it has to say about history. And much of what it has to say about history is really coded often in theological ways. And certainly, if nothing else, it's a book written for monks about monasticism. And I suppose in reading this book, I started to take a step along a journey, which I think you have to take if you want to understand this topic, which is trying to see the world from the point of view of the Peregrini themselves. Now, I've put the page here to tell us about the Holy Columba, who was born of noble parents, leaving his father and mother, to, in the second year after the Battle of Culdrevna, the 42nd year of his age, sail away from Ireland to Britain, wishing to be a peregrinus, a pilgrim for Christ. So I think Alex, you called it, was it an exile or something? No, I can't remember what you called it, but that word peregrinus, and it's from peregrinatio, pilgrimage is often what people call pilgrim and pilgrimage. But actually what it really conveys is something, well, rather more complicated. So perhaps we could go on to number 3 now, please, Alex. Okay, so what I want to talk about then is some stories, particularly narratives of Peregrinatio from within the Columban family about the world in which Columba and his successors, monastic successors, lived. But I want to say right from the beginning that what we see here is a number of different sorts of patterns. On the one hand, the travels of monks of Iona and their fellow travellers manifest patterns of Peregrinatio. Peregrinatio has certain formulae, certain codes, certain indicators, if you like. Narratives of Peregrinatio are redolent with those indicators. They're not always historical. Often they amount in some ways to parables. And I guess the really obvious comparison to me, and one I think that is not accidental, is often they're stories rather like, in this case, stories of the Desert Fathers. So many of the same sorts of ideas are to be seen in them. And I think we often have to realize that what we read, perhaps as looking like history, is actually stories that are parables. They're meant to be edifying. They're meant to convey certain symbolic ideas. And so to read these texts in a way, if not become a theologian, you have to at least become someone who sees the world a little bit from the point of view of a monk, someone for whom stories are often explaining things that are important about the monastic life. Now, what is a peregrinus? What is peregrinatio? Well, quite a few of the lecturers in this series, I'm sure, will give you opinions on that. But I guess the defining step of the peregrinus is a person who puts away from them their family and insulates themselves from their past life. So you put aside your family, you take up the cross and follow Christ. But in a very powerful expression, and there's an episode particularly in the life of St Columbanus, the other Columba, the younger one, where Columbanus has a conversation with a holy woman who says the higher peregrinatio, or the better peregrinatio, is when you cross the sea. And so in many ways, peregrinatio is both a statement of leaving and cutting oneself off from a past life, but making a journey across the sea is actually a clean break. It's something that gives you an entry into a new life. Now, one of the problems, however, of people's understanding of peregrinatio is often they don't really quite connect up or don't really understand the fact it doesn't really work in a terribly linear way. It's not like you're going progressively on a set of steps towards greater asceticism, because after you cross the sea, very often peregrini turn out to go into pastoral careers. Some become bishops, some work in pastoral care, others go on to be monks in large monasteries, only a few go on to become very extreme ascetics. So peregrinatio is not a linear, but perhaps in some ways a progression through a series of steps. And at each stage, perhaps like many stages of monastic life, each stage is a new beginning. And in some ways, we often see that even written in the geography of monasticism. Okay, go to slide 4, if we could. Thank you. Now, I want to say right from the beginning that, therefore, I think there are historiographical challenges, okay? Challenges in the way we interpret history, the way we write history. And I think some of the key ones are that we have to use narratives that are chiefly literary and theological to understand the Peregrini. We also have to be conscious, and in his introduction, Alex has referred to this, conscious of the fact that a lot of the historiography of insular peregrinatio, we're not talking about the Irish who go to the continent here, we're talking about the ones who work either within Britain and Ireland, their own countries, or at least going to each other's or out into the islands of the ocean. So within the insular world, we often find a tendency of historians to sort of mash up peregrinatio with travel for the purposes of secular mission. That is to say, travel for the purposes of setting up churches for pastoral care, and sometimes also traveling along with secular people in a pastoral role that is related to them. And finally, also sometimes just sending people into new territories to convert them. These aren't primarily functions of peregrinatio, though a peregrinus might end up becoming a missionary after leaving home. Most of the time we're talking about people who in the first instance have the desire for the ascetic life. Though in the stories of peregrinatio, often the desire for the ascetic life is one of the things that is most frustrated, because as part of the humility of being a monk, part of that is accepting whatever you're called to do, even if your desire is most powerfully for the desert. Finally, and this is something that I think particularly pertains to our topic here, there's also a bit of a tendency for the people who go to the continent to be the more visible, and that's because in a way in our modern perception, Irish who went abroad to the places of power or where they had most influence, and where they are after all written about more because there are more texts from the continent, that these people get more attention, and we can sometimes mistake their prominence in the continental context for being the more important expression. I mean, if you go and live on a remote island in the Atlantic, does anybody care what you're doing? But I think I want to say that one of the things we need to be aware of is it's often the monks who go into the wilderness in antiquity and the early Middle Ages who are also still celebrated. The act of going out and coming back from the edge of the world, going out into remote places, those who are in most remote places, such as the Desert Fathers, are often extremely famous in reality. Well, I'm going to propose that the people who went out into the ocean became somewhat famous as well. And one of our problems is how we assess that and how we might prove that. Okay, but I'm going to propose that we start thinking about our people as ocean fathers, as people in a way who are the counterparts of the Desert Fathers, just out on the other edge of the known world as it was at the time. Now, just for a few of the methodological ideas, or also just note an article I wrote some years ago for the Festria for Donica Choroin, which is referenced on the bottom of this page, is some of my statements and methodology on this, if you're really interested in following that up. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay. Now, in our stories in the life of St Columba, which was written around about 700 AD, St Columba died in 597, having gone to Scotland sometime in the 560s from his home in the north of Ireland. His life was written by Adamnorn, who was in succession by some intervening people, in succession to Columba as an abbot of Iona. Probably the life, I suspect, was written for the centenary of Columba's death, so aiming at 697, whether or not it was completed by then. But as Adamnorn died in 704, we can put a fairly close date on that. And also, as many of you will know, this is one of the few texts from this period to survive in a manuscript made almost approximately in proximity to the actual writing of the life. So the life comes to us from a manuscript from the second decade of the 700s, so within about 20 years of the completion of the life, a very unusual circumstance. And it's a beautiful manuscript too in Schaffhausen today. Now, in this, we have many stories about the different types of religious life that people are leading and how what happens to them they go in on peregrinatio, where they end up. And I say many of these are parables, and we might not doubt that they're based on largely historical information. But one thing I want to stress is that it's important to take seriously what they say about the different types of religious life, and particularly the importance of the most ascetic and how highly it was regarded. So a typical example is a man called Virno, and it said he rode over from Ireland and he remained for the rest of his life in the island of Hinba, an unidentifiable island monastery founded by Columba. After completing irreproachably many years of subjection among the brothers, this Virno completed another 12 years as a glorious soldier of Christ, leading the life of an anchorite in the place of the anchorites at Muirvolog Mar, the Great Bay, I suppose, and literally the Great Sea Sack or Sea Bag. Again, another unidentified place. There are many challenges to archaeology here. The symbolism of being a soldier of Christ is interesting. Actually, at the beginning of the book, we hear that Columba was described as an island soldier. The monks who live in the islands are milites insulani. So there's a degree to which the idea of leading the life of an anchorite is seen as a sort of spiritual warfare, which is not unique, obviously, to this world, this particular context. What we see here, though, is that we see a brother going, first of all, to living in a more central monastery, but then also going to lead the life of an anchorite. And the life of an anchorite, living apart from people, is a very important expression of asceticism. But in fact, many of these people could live in their career in more than one type of context. And we see then through our descriptions of the Hebrides and the islands beyond, people who hold very specific categories of religious life. And the variety of what they live is an important part of the story of what a peregrinus can live like. So it's not that being a peregrinus is just being an anchorite, but also maybe it's one of the expressions that may be taken up. Now, identifying then where particularly monasteries or anchoretic cells and things like that is often a question of considering the landscape, but also particularly, as Ian Fisher has done very thoughtfully in his magnificent corpus of inscribed stones in the Western Isles, a matter of considering the relational questions of landscape. Some monasteries, some hermitages are close to secular settlements. Perhaps that implies they have a sort of dependent relationship of pastoral care, but some are right out in the middle of nowhere. And he cites particularly the example of the great hermitage at North Rona, that's right out beyond the territory of Gaelic-speaking Scotland. And that these places too are important. Perhaps they're considered, like the place of the anchorites at Muirvol Mar, as being a place where particularly chosen people or people with a special vocation will go to. Now, I guess the point I'm making there is just because something is further away doesn't mean it's out of sight and out of mind. It's the variety of the religious life that is impressive in these communities. The next slide, please. Just refer quickly here to some discussions that people have made of this topic. I'm not going to dwell on the Hebridean expansion, as I call it, but just note a few of the many historical studies. Ian Fisher I've referred to, a particularly thoughtful discussion of the variety of landscape sites and the evidence for them. Christian Aronson's exciting book, Into the Ocean, that talks about a lot of the aspects of settlement in the islands of the Hebrides and out into the North Atlantic. And also David Dunville's reflection on what he calls the North Atlantic monastic thalassocracy, which particularly explores, and I think it's important to remember here, the fact that on the one hand, the sea is used as a barrier symbolically to separate oneself from one's homeland. But when you're getting into the Hebrides, there's another thing going on as well, and that is the fact that this is a place where the sea is one of its major connecting elements. So the kingdoms of Gaelic Scotland are also places that are joined by sea. That's another factor of complexity in reading these works. Can we have the next one? Okay, now I'll start with a couple of stories of people who I think are exemplary of parables of the hermit life and peregrinatio in the life of St Columba, but also I want to reflect particularly in the spirit of this lecture series on the symbolisms that are inherent in them. We can read these stories as if they're simply stories of things that people did, and we can do what pre-modern scholars often did, which is take all the miracles out and just pretend the narratives are historical. Or we can look for some of the specific symbolisms and how they interact with other aspects of peregrinatio and asceticism. The first story I'm telling you briefly is by a man called Bedorn Uania Talog, who was a monk who consulted with St Columba, presumably of his community, who was said to have gone in search of a desert in the ocean, desertum in oceano or heremus in oceano. That alternates between those two words, both meaning desert. the one the Latin, the one the Greek. Eremos derived from Greek. But a desert might mean a broad desert place, a metaphor for the desert of Egypt where the monks live. It might, on the other hand, mean a deserted place or an empty place, but then that's what a desert is anyway. So the interplay of these terms will always be a bit ambiguous. In a fairly interesting example of a monastic narrative, Columba says that this man Bedorn, though he seeks a desert place, will not be buried, will not rest in that place, but will be buried in a place in which a woman shall drive sheep across his grave. And then at a certain point later on, he goes out into the ocean, he fails to find his desert place, and he comes back and he ends up in a monastery nearer to a settlement. And one day there is an attack by marauders. The people take refuge in what should be the outer enclosure of the monastery. And I've got a picture here of an early Irish monastery from the Dingle Peninsula, which has this dividing line down the middle. And you can see that in the foreground in the dwarf wall in this actual photograph of the same place. But on the other side, and if you look to the left of this photo, you can see the inner area, the inner enclosure, which is really only where men and special guests of the monastery are allowed to go and where the monks are buried, precisely so your grave will not be trampled by secular people. But then some of the sheep get out, a woman chases the sheep and she ends up going across his grave, which is a sort of humility topos, because even though this man has sought a desert, one of the things you find repeatedly also in the lives of the Desert Fathers, or the sayings of the Desert Fathers, is the frustration of the ascetic ideal by people who drop in, but because it is the duty of a monk to extend hospitality, and even in death in this case, you sort of have to put up with it. So your ideal might be to go to a place where no one can find you, but actually you may be frustrated in that. And a lot of the stories of Peregrinatio sort of work a bit like that. The monk desires the desert, fasts, repeatedly fasts, goes to live in a cave somewhere, crosses the sea, having sort of got that part out of the way, then often goes on to work in something that is a much more pastorally facing role. And that is in some ways a statement of the humility that a true penitent will have, that they will endure that lack of privacy because it also is God's work. Okay, can we go on to the next one then? And the other one in the life of St Columba that gives us a lot of parables of this is a character called Cormac Ualaithen, who is probably a more favourite character in the story. He goes on to become an abbot of Durrow, a major Columban monastery in Ireland, so he's clearly a more prominent figure than Bedorn. He goes on 3 voyages, also in search of a desertum or heremus, and all of these carry with them formulae that we find in other monastic literature relating to the travels of monks. In one episode, he carries a monk with him who has departed with permission of his abbot, which is a motif that crops up later on, particularly famously in the story of St Brendan, who takes his 3 late-coming monks with him, and in other of the Imrev tales as well, the Irish equivalents of that tale. Now, in another chapter of the life of St Columba, Cormac goes on 2 further voyages. One of them, he goes up the western coast of Scotland and ends up in the islands of Orkney, where he happens to be protected because Columba, who is up in the northeast of Scotland at Inverness, is talking to the King of the Picts at the time, and the King of Orkney is actually a client of the King of the Picts. So Columba, who can predict that Cormac might end up in Orkney, which might not be a particularly supernatural prediction if he knew which way he was going, exerts a not terribly supernatural intervention here by simply using his political force, as it were, to ensure that if Cormac turns up in Orkney, he will be protected. But then in a fairly typical juxtaposition, a 3rd voyage, which occurs in the same chapter, so the 2 in the same chapter, sees Cormac driven with full sails in a straight course from land towards the region of the northern sky for 14 days and as many nights. Such a voyage appeared to be beyond the range of human exploration and one from which there could be no return. He ends up being in his boat covered in hide, attacked by wee beasties with stings, rather sort of, complicated motif, let's just say, but is rescued by the intervention of the saint in a more formally supernatural way. Now, this story, I think, actually provides us with some interesting thoughts. And again, I'm not inclined to take all of it literally, though you'll be absolutely, probably not amazed, actually, that there have been many attempts to try to identify the little beasts as if they were real. Clearly, they are sort of infernal creatures. Indeed, one sort of a study suggested they were giant jellyfish. I think we're dealing with monastic literature here and quite a bit of symbolism, but there you go. Columba, on the one hand, is the master of the northeast. He goes to Inverness. He can extend his power over Cormac in that direction. But then he's also the master of the wide ocean. So looking in the other direction, due north or northwest, he's also in command of the great forces of that part of the world. But also this story gives us an interesting clue, because the Columban familia is not just confining itself and its interests to the Hebrides, but in fact, the very edge of the world is one of its places of concern. It's worth comparing this to the Egyptian fathers. The desert fathers of Egypt live at another boundary of the world, because just south of there, they confront the fact that in those days, people thought the equator was impassable, and that was a sort of infernal zone because of its heat. But here at the other end of the world, our monks are keeping vigil on a part of the world that is the other end of the world, because that's, people think that beyond Ireland and Scotland, there's really pretty much nothing out there. And so Cormac is one of the first who goes out into this infernal zone and returns, finding there is no profit in this place, but endures something which is a contemplation of an apocalyptic landscape, an apocalyptic place, which is what it should be if you're living on the edge, let us say. Now, all of this would only be of passing interest, except that Adam Norn wrote this in around 700 AD, and he thought, presumably at that time, well, he would have probably had Cormac visit somewhere else if he thought there was anything to find. What we do know from another source is about 30 years later, Irish monks did settle on islands further out in the ocean. And I'll come to that point in just a moment. We move on to the next slide. Now, our next exhibit, going beyond the time of Adam Norn, is an author called de Quille. And de Quille is a very interesting character. He was a learned man, not just a geographer. He was also interested in cosmography and a range of other topics. And he was an Irish exile who worked at the court of Louis the Pious, the Holy Roman Emperor. And he wrote a geographical treatise called De Mensura Orbis Terrae. De Mensura, presumably on the measurement of the earth, could just be on the limits of the earth, semantically, but people know better than me on that, so I won't venture too far. And in this book, in a rather interesting way, which crops up occasionally with northern writers, he sort of pops into a largely derivative discussion of geography, a little bit of first-hand information that he clearly had when he lived up in the north. So he was clearly an Irish monk who'd come not just from Ireland, probably originally from Ireland, but had been up in the Northern Isles. And in fact, the internal evidence of his text very clearly suggests that he had his novitiate on Iona itself. So in all likelihood, he was a member of the Columban familia. And he tells us about monks who in his time had been going further up to the north. He talks about a presbyter religiosus, a priest to a monastic community, one assumes, who had been to somewhere that sounds like the Shetlands. And he says that in islands further out than that, in some unnamed islands, there were heremitae and anchoritae, so hermits and anchorites living in islands further out into the ocean. And finally, he'd also spoken to some clerici, however we translate that, who had spent a period from February through to August on an island called Thule. Now, Thule, he equated this island with the classical Thule, the place where the sun had its zenith and there was no night, a bit like the Northern Hemisphere at the moment. And these people had observed, had measured, if you like, tested the assumptions of the ancients. They wanted to find out whether it was not daylight all the time there or just daylight at midsummer, a matter that I think was of quite considerable theological interest as well as geographical, as we will see. And I guess I would say to you, here is one important point. Even though Adam Norn is a hagiographer, he's writing the life of a saint, where Dicuil is writing a geography, I would say that both have to be susceptible to reading the theological codes in them, that these are not modern writers, and the modern distinction between science and religion is not the same as the one in the past. Okay, can we move on to our next slide? So Dicuil, I want to talk about this passage. Now, a number of you have heard me talk about this before, but I am bringing in things that I have discussed before. I'm trying to make some new thoughts about this. Anyway, there is another small set of islands, he said, nearly all separated by narrow stretches of water, and in these for nearly 100 years, hermits sailing from our country islanders live. He's writing in 825, so he's writing about things that happened about 100 years before, about 730. And this would fit with the idea, for what it's worth, that these are islands that were discovered maybe after Adam Norn wrote, so they didn't get into his story. It says, now because of the Northman pirates, they are emptied of anchorites and filled with countless sheep and many diverse kinds of seabirds. He also adds that they never found these references in the ancient writers, and that they were deserted from the beginning of time. Now, I'm interested in these descriptions because with my sort of interest in landscape archaeology, I also think it's interesting to speculate that if an Irish monk landed in the Faroe Islands, would they have been able to tell whether people had been living there or not? You know, that it was completely unsettled territory or that people had lived there distantly in the past. I mean, prehistoric people lived in the Orkneys and in Shetland and in St Kilda. So maybe they lived in the Faroes. But in fact, when you go to the Faroes, one thing you do see really is there's not a lot of land, actually. And I'm quite sure that Irish monks, many of whom had grown up as on farms, probably knew perfectly well whether a landscape had been adapted by people or not. So I'm inclined to think they're telling the truth about that. Now, why is that interesting? Because deserted lands were all, in a way, boxes to tick as you went west. Tom O'Loughlin, in his excellent exegesis of the theology of St Patrick, has pointed out how strongly St Patrick stressed the idea that the Irish were on the edge of the world, and indeed that Ireland might be one of the last nations as you go out into the edges of the world, and that the conversion of the last nations could be a trigger, if you like, or a sign at least, of the coming apocalypse. So it's very possible that the people who are arriving here are making geographical observations, but they're also doing something religious as well. And these islands, these deserted islands, don't seem to be settled by the Irish. This doesn't seem to be secular settlement traveling with religious settlement. These are peregrini crossing the sea, and they're living in this place and colonizing this land apparently just with hermits and anchorites, which does seem to be very interesting. And then when the islands are deserted and all that is left behind is sheep and seabirds, there's a kind of apocalyptic sort of air to this in a way, like people have come and gone. And of course, it is a bit of an apocalypse because the Northman pirates have driven them out. I wonder at this event, a very early reference around about the early 800s to Vikings attacking religious communities. And it's often interested me that when we go through the earlier texts in Adam Norn, often we had the people who are the explorers named. But here, these people, some of whom might genuinely have been martyred for all we know, you know, if there was a violent conflict, and the land is made empty in this very dramatic way. And none of these people are named by Dicuil, and we have no evidence from any other source of whether any of these people were martyrs who were remembered as martyrs. And indeed, the further step, as we will see, is that I think, if we go to the next slide now, one of the things that a lot of people, just passing, I'll come back to that point in a moment, just say, also on the Faroe Islands, there are, as we see in the corner of this picture from Churchibu in the Faroes, we do have cross slabs that are insular in quality as well. And the problems being, we don't know whether they're insular slabs from the Irish period that Dicuil is talking about, or whether they come from Hiberno Norse settlement. But anyway, that's as may be. Can we go to the next one? I don't get bogged down on that. Just a note, as I've discussed this particularly in a discussion of the date of the voyage of St Brendan, one of the things that I've argued, and I'm not the only person to argue this, is that the Faroe Islands and their descriptions as islands of sheep and birds, and even the point that the islands were deserted because of some apocalyptic event, is referred to, I would argue, in the story of the adjacent islands of sheep and birds that are deserted but for one man who survives, that's in the voyage of St Brendan. And in the life of St Brendan, a corresponding incident in which 12 pilgrims are terrorised by a cat, and only one remains in the end, because the cat eats the food that the other brethren used to eat and goes giant. But the motif again, something, one person left behind. And yet I should note in the voyage of St Brendan, the sheep are big too. So there's parallelisms there. But finally, also an interesting text and often overlooked, the early Irish tale Imre Snegus agus Macregla, which is a story from about 900 CE AD, in which the travellers, who are monks of St Columba, travelling in this case in the 700s, so at the time indeed when the Irish are living in the Faroes, the monks come to a place where they meet a warrior who is described as a true brother of the men of Ireland, who's the sole survivor of a crew massacred by foreigners without faith who live on the other part of the island. And the next island is full of birds. So I think we have the same idea here again, this motif. People who've been living on the island, driven out by some event, leaving behind certain iconic things, sheep, birds, a single person. Also in this case, particularly, the warrior is described as a true brother, which makes you suspect maybe the underlying story here, and perhaps the underlying story of the voyage of St Brendan, is again a monastic story that perhaps has been sort of secularized here. But I guess I take from these, and you've got to take my word for the argument here, you can read it at greater length somewhere else, that one of the things this tells me, for what it's worth, is that the stories of these islands had a wider currency, that people were actually interested in what happened up there. And they made a somewhat apocalyptic narrative and a narrative of sacrifice out of an event that occurred deep in the ocean in a place lived in only by hermits and anchorites. And a lot of people have argued that particularly the famous transmission of some of this detail about these voyages to a wider world is the Voyage of St Brendan, a work written in Latin and circulating all over Europe. St Brendan becomes in some ways the archetypal voyaging saint, but his story, written in around the 800s, so close to the time these events are taking place, takes in events out of these real voyages, but takes in theological motifs of them, or creates theological motifs of them, but gives clues in a way perhaps also to some of the symbolisms of what is going on, because it, of course, is a very much apocalyptic narrative in its prophecy anyway. So I think in some ways the very complicated debate about this, but an awful lot of people have written about this topic, gives us a clue that these are not obscure events, that people thought there was something very important, both about people living here and the fact that people were also driven out. And it became a sort of true desert again. Okay, can we move on to the next slide? In particular, I want to refer you then to a few discussions that are very important here. Donica Corroyne's Irish and Nordic Exchange, a discussion of the settlements in the Faroes. Also my own, The Date of Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abatis, which talks about all those arguments I've just been outlining there about sheep, birds and all that stuff. Also Ian Fisher and Ian Scott's article on this early medieval sculpture from the Faroe Islands, which contains some of these insular materials. But this is one of the really interesting touchstones of what is going on in the Columban familia, in my opinion. If it is Columban monks, which I think more and more we should suspect it is. Now, could we move on again? Now, we'll turn quickly to Iceland, and I'm going to finish up fairly soon, so we'll just pass through a bit of evidence here. I want a few minutes just to have a few conclusions to draw overall. But as is well known, de Quille also writes about how 30 years prior to his writings, so in about 795, he had met clerici who had lived on the island of Thule from the 1st of February to the 1st of August, and even says they voyaged there in February. I mean, you know, voyaging there in February in a large car ferry is fairly hard work. Imagine doing it in a small boat. But they told him that not only the summer solstice, but in the days round about it, the sun setting in the evening hides itself as though behind a small hill. There's a picture actually taken at Skálholt, the main episcopal see in Iceland, on Midsummer's Day. That's what it looks like. And according to Dick Quill, if you lived in Iceland over that period, you could see anything you want. You could see to do anything you want, including picking the lice out of your shirt. Welcome to the Middle Ages. Can we move on to the next one? He says, the men voyaged there in the natural time of great cold, and entering the island had day and night alternately, except for the period of the solstice. But one day, sail north of that, they found the sea frozen over. I just want to show you a few of my nice pictures of Iceland, obviously. But the interesting thing is, I think, is, you know, particularly Tom O'Loughlin pointed out to me many years ago about this, is that the idea of the sun setting and not setting is important. If the sun did not ever set, it would be a place that had, you know, no day and night, but only day, which would be possibly then it existed in a special place outside the rules normal to the world. That would be a scientific way, perhaps, of measuring it empirically, but it also might correspond to the paradise, the New Jerusalem at the end of Revelation. So maybe these were people who thought we better go and test whether when we go out into the ocean, we don't end up seamlessly getting to the New Jerusalem. Or maybe that's what we would like, because if we're religious people, maybe that's sort of, you know, what we're out to find. That would be sort of the ultimate discovery of Peregrinatio. And of course, if you think about it, that's exactly what happens to St Brendan in the Voyage of St Brendan. He ends up in the New Jerusalem, where he gets to see the prophecies of the coming events before going home. However, these guys, these clerici, found out, in fact, that there was alternating day and night, except at the solstice. So again, while we're reading a geography here, many of its codes converge quite interestingly with the more imaginative literature that these same voyages are contributing to, which seems, you know, again, where we have this question of how do we ask questions, seeing things from both the point of view of the historian and the theologian. Can we flip on to another one here? Okay, now one of the questions that has interested me over a period of time now is to ask a question exactly who these monks are, who these people are, where they're coming from. And it's tied up with the fact that I've been doing some field work in Iceland at a place called the Sandur Estuarial Plain, which you can see here in the background, flanked by these large glaciers. And in the foreground, the islands known as the Westman Islands or the Vestmannaeyjar. We move to the next slide. Various sites here, the site of Seljaland, which is in the edge of the escarpment there, Kverka Hekla, which is on the edge of this other, it's just around the corner, the western side of the escarpment, and also the Vestmannaeyjar and Sandur sites here, where we've been doing field work. Now, this is particularly developing the work, the very brilliant work of Christian Aronson, whose book Into the Ocean has really revalued a lot of the evidence from the Sandur region as showing, he would argue, and I'm inclined to agree with him, the likelihood that we're either dealing with a very early Norse period of settlement, we may be in the settlement of the Irish themselves. Now, I hasten to say here, Dick Quill, I think, leaves us with no alternative to believe that the Irish are both in the Faroe Islands and Iceland. So it's not a question of proving they were there, it's a question of proving where they were. And paleo-environmental evidence from the Sandur estuary generally suggests early human settlement in the early 800s or mid 800s, possibly, certainly seemingly around or just before the time of the Norse landings in 870, 871. So we could be dealing with a horizon of Irish occupation that is very close to, but just before the arrival of the Norse, which seems to have been the case also in the Faroe Islands. We flip over to the next couple of slides. This cave here, excavated by Christian in the early 2000s, seems to have spoil from the cutting of the cave. These are man-made caves dug for shelter, which is thrown out onto the foreground of the picture here outside the cave and sealed by a volcanic layer that can be dated to around about 871-2. To 871-2. So it seems to precede the year of the Norse arrival. But you know, one excavation is not solely proof. There are other explanations have been offered. So what we're looking at is how do we make a multidisciplinary landscape study to try to accumulate a range of different types of evidence. You just flip to the next slide. I just note that we have been recording for some years at a series of caves nearby, Seljellands Hetleer, and this man-made cave, again, you can see the tool marks on the wall, is literally peppered with what look like insular crosses. Now, the problem with crosses is that they're carved in rock. You can't date a cross by any scientific means. You mainly date them by typology. But on the other hand, you can sequence them in the order of their construction, and you may be able to create relationships between those and excavated material. We're not there yet, but there's plenty to say about this. But that really is for another time. Just a note, if you're interested in the progress of this, there is a report in the Society for Medieval Archaeology newsletter for 2019, including some of these pictures. Okay, then we move on again, I think, to the last slide. Okay, so I just want to say a few words at the end here about some of these I've been saying and try to bring them together to talk about how we find methods for understanding the journeys of the Peregrini in this context, what is Peregrinatio and what is not Peregrinatio, and how we understand its significance, not just in terms of things that matter to us, like who were the first Europeans to land in the Faroe Islands, or, you know, how was settlement extended there, but to try to think of some of the questions that were the ones that medieval monastics were thinking about. So I brought us back to my historiographical challenges slide again, and I want to just think of a few particular points to make about that. Now, first of all, as we've seen, we have a series of pieces of evidence for activity coming from the early Middle Ages in the Hebrides. And these particularly centre inevitably on Iona. We have on the one hand the life of Columba by Adamnorn, though we have also collateral sources for the life of Columba, and also more importantly, not just the life of Columba, but in a sense, the persona of Columba as it was expressed to his cult. Because whatever Columba himself was like, or whatever his own aims were like, it's in the nature of a saint's cult that the saint's cult comes to represent a range of ideas that develop over time. When you are dealing with Columba, in many ways, you are dealing with Adamnorn's projection of Columba, and maybe much of what we find in Columba is what Adamnorn has drawn out of that cult across that last century between him and his subject. We see then, going on from that, the clear evidence that someone like de Quille has been up in this area as well, and he, at least based in Iona, has been in contact living within these places. That doesn't prove, of course, that the monks who lived in the Faroe Islands and in Iceland, or were there monks living in Iceland, I'll come to that in a second, were monks of St Columba, because it could be that they would call in at Iona, or monks of Iona would be interested in what other monastic families were doing up there anyway. But I am inclined to think that there is a lot of evidence pointing towards the idea that we are really dealing with something that is a long-term pattern of expansion, if you like, or extension, probably a better word, of monastic life into the ocean that centres upon the ideology coming out of Iona. But to argue that in full would be taking too long today and whetting your appetite, as it were. I've tried to suggest that when we read narratives like the life of St Columba, like the De Mentura Orbis Terrae of de Quille, we are dealing with a literature on the one hand that probably does relay basic historical facts, but it may not be doing so. Some of these characters could be more or less wholly invented in the way they're going on. There's 100 years between Columba's death and the time out of Norman rights. People could be events of different periods, could be being conflated together. But still, these parables are talking in general terms about things that the Columban familia is doing, because we find monks living further out again in the ocean in the next generation. When we get to de Quille's writings, we are dealing with somebody who's writing seemingly in a more European tradition of geographical learning, a more empirical tradition. But I still think that within his writing, you can find some of the codes and the symbolisms of what narratives of Peregrinatio we're concerned with, which could be, on the one hand, the journey of the individual across various boundaries, out of their home into the sea, across the sea, into other aspects of religious life, but also living on the edge of the ocean, like the Desert Fathers, contemplating the wilderness that lies to the other side of them, that like the Israelites in Exodus, a favourite comparison, they look back to the land they have left, the land of their origin, the land that in a way was keeping them closed in. They go to live in the desert, where they live in a sense between worlds, but they look upon the promised land to come. And so that symbolism is partly then written out in the literary narratives. The question I suppose we should always ask ourselves is, if you lived in the Faroe Islands miles from anywhere, or in Iceland miles from anywhere, did you also perhaps suspect that in some ways those stories were real? That in fact you were contemplating a totally unknown place on the other side. And maybe in a way that did affect the vigils that you kept and your vision of where you were keeping your vigils in the scheme of the world. But also, and finally, that we look at Peregrinatio as something which is stereotyped in a way by the continental enterprise, which Alex and others have written about, so eloquently. But out here, there's something slightly more untidy going on. We don't have a lot of facts. We have some settlement evidence. We have things going on out here. We have some of the odd things going on, like crazy clerics. Why are they clerics and not monks? Are they learned men or clerks, in a sense? Is that the sort of semantics of it? Going out and measuring strange scientific things. Fairly interesting date too. I mean, the Vikings are floating around. There's the coronation of Charlemagne's not too far down the track either. They might not even be Irish people, these clerici, but they might be going to somewhere where the Irish are keeping vigil in Iceland. They might not be the only people going there. When the Norse Icelanders turn up later on, they say there are Irish people living there. So something's going on to take people that far out. What I suppose is interesting to me is when you look at the literary representations, the way it plays out, into tales like the Voyages of Brendan, a monastic tale written for a monastic audience who would have understood many of its cues better than we do. That it is, in a sense, taking this place where these anonymous monks have gone, and it's putting a much earlier monk, St Brendan, maybe one who commands enough attention, a character who can pull the story along, and putting him in this place. And doing that to make these places better known, or maybe because they're already well known. Maybe the stories of the monks who live in the ocean have an enormous currency. Maybe they are the brave warriors on the edge of the world who other people are looking at and saying, a little bit like the monks of Egypt, these people are out there fighting the good fight for me, who lives a more central life. That's what they are chosen to do. So maybe our ocean fathers, in a way, are people who have quite a great significance. I suppose I say one of our problems, to conclude, is that when we read the stories of the Norse settlers going out in this area, they, of course, in many ways project themselves as refugees. They're people running away from the centre to sort of go and find new and empty spaces. Also, when we look at what a lot of historical and archaeological analysis that inevitably drifts into is the idea that settlements on islands will mainly be by crofters, sort of avatars of them, the more modern style of island settler. But when you get to the Faroe Islands, all you've got is hermits and anchorites. The most extraordinary way to settle somewhere for the first time. And I guess we have to look and say, if hermits and anchorites are going out and being really the only settlers on such a remote place, something rather important must be going on, at least in their scheme of things. And maybe it isn't something that is about getting away from sight, but is something in a way that people are taking account of and sort of want to know about. I can't prove that entirely, but there are suggestions there in the literature. So it all depends how you read texts and how much you are mindful of the religious codes in them. And I'll stop at that point and apologise for going a little over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that very rich and very stimulating and exciting presentation, particularly on the fieldwork that you and Christian Aronson are doing in Iceland. That's really, really exciting. So thank you very much. I'm just mindful of time and that I want to open the floor to any questions that the attendees may have. There's a Q&A button there that you can put in any questions, and I can field them. So any questions that you'd like to ask, please put it in the Q&A section. Thank you. We mentioned, Jonathan, about the name Celluland before, and I think we talked about that it can refer to a shieling, but I'm thinking, you know, and we mentioned Selja on the west coast of Norway. It can also mean blessed, so sailing. But it's interesting that both those place names have
Yes, it is, isn't it?
kind of links. And I suppose that was my question, because you know, there's been a debate in Norwegian historiography in the 1880s about whether Irish monks ended up in Selja. And because if you look in the map, it's pretty much exactly across from the Faroes. So and it's interesting, they're actually doing georadar survey now in Selja. My good friend Reagan Meyer is doing georadar on Selja, so who knows what that might turn up. Do you have any thoughts on the place name? Or
I mean, the problem, of course, with place names, as you know, is that also they can be convergent. You know, you can have two words that, you know, are easily interchangeable. I mean, I'm not an expert on that particular word, or even Icelandic, Norse philology in general, but you know, one is skeptical of these things often just because they seem a bit too convenient. But you know, I guess we're open to any sort of argument that's based on facts. You know, as to whether there are Irish at Selja in Norway, that's been discussed, of course, at some length in a variety of studies, including one by yourself. You know, it remains a bit doubtful, I've always suspected. But, you know, the key thing is, I mean, Irish, there's an Irish element in the conversion of Scandinavia anyway, so these stories could be drawn along into that. The question is how early they are, or what evidence we really have. The symbolism of it could also be important in its own right, but you'd be better qualified to answer that than me.
I just have a couple of questions here. One from Alexander Couples. So just in terms of dating of crosses by typology, could you say anything about that?
Well, I think if you want to look at the material in the North Atlantic islands, thank you for this question, it is an interesting question. I think, first of all, I'd look at the very important corpuses by Ian Fisher, and also at the analysis in Christian Aronson's book, where he talks about the relative dates of these. They talk about the relative dates of these crosses and their possible symbolism. The symbolism of the cross at Arcs, and as a symbol specifically of pilgrimage, yes, I mean, that was Peter Harbison and a few other people have argued around that. The key issue is, you know, whether you can date these things and make fundamental associations of them with sites for a particular purpose, much of which is circumstantial. But I'd refer you to those writers who know more about it than me, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd say also, Alexander, to check out the new book by Louise Nugent on pilgrimage, Journeys of Faith. Yeah, it's an excellent book. Couple of other questions, one by Stuart. On these remote, unfertile lands, has it been established what the diet of the peregrini? So what?
Well, the problem with establishing the diet, I mean, depends upon us being absolutely sure we've got the right sites to begin with. I mean, there's cart and horse sort of problem there, but also the difficulty is the sort of evidence you need to find is things like middens, for example, or evidence of where people have disposed of their detritus from eating. Maybe if you could find burials, but burials do not notably survive in the environments we're looking at. We're at an early stage here. Often what we have is sites that are largely marked by sculpture. And what we have to really do is excavate. The only one serious candidate for an Irish site, which I still think may well be an Irish site, has been excavated in Iceland, and it found nothing significantly early enough to make it an Irish site. When you're getting out into the evidence we're looking at in Celluland and related areas, we're mainly looking at areas where we either have sculptural evidence or evidence of the building of an actual structure in the case of the cave, or we have paleo-environmental evidence, which gives us, well, one thing it does tell us is that we have ruminants, we have grazing animals, probably sheep, perhaps cattle. That would tell you something about diet, but everything else is probably inference. I mean, seabird, eggs, fish, these are all the things you eat in that part of the world. I imagine that's what we're talking about. I don't know what sort of crops could really be raised in that environment, but we're at an early stage in understanding really whether we even have the Irish in the place we think they are at all. So in time, one would hope, Can
you talk a little bit about kind of what's the next stage in terms of the fieldwork and the work that you're doing on Iceland?
Yes, I mean, the moment we're recording sculpture, we're trying to make relationships of that sculpture with anything that's datable. And we're also looking at the wider environment. Christian's book sets out the basic methodology as well as anything you're likely to read. I guess our question is, at a certain point, do we need to have a targeted fieldwork campaign or something? That's well down the track, I think, at this stage. But these things take an enormously long time, if you see what I mean. And I guess at the moment, what we're looking at is trying to make relationships between the sculpture that we have in terms of their chronological relations within the site, but also whether we can get subsets of forms we can compare, say, to Hebridean sculpture, which is looking quite promising, and see whether we have a sort of prima facie case that this is likely to be material of medieval date and of a regionally specific type. The difficulty is, always, to find the smoking gun, if you like, to find the evidence with archaeology that is more than circumstantial. And I'm kind of cautious. I don't venture opinions on that too quickly. But there's some very interesting things about the environments we're looking at in Iceland. We have other questions to ask as well. I mean, de Quille only says that people visited Iceland. Do we infer from much later Norse sources that the Irish were actually living there? And there are also interesting questions about what they were doing there in the long term, what happened to them when the Norse arrived. There's a lot of discussion of this. And I think one of the things is that because we've got some more tangible evidence coming up, people are revisiting these questions. And obviously, like any aspects of medieval studies in nation states, people also, as time goes on, ask new questions because the way they looked at the world in one era changes, they look at a different way, like we do in Ireland or anywhere else. History moves on and we ask different questions. And I guess it's been very stimulating even just having those conversations.
Oh, thank you. Just a question from Maureen Nidonica. Would you say that the idea of the lone survivor who lives to relate the tale of the previous lost generation, as in the tales of the invasions of Ireland or Tuon Mochstarn, etc., might have influenced the idea of the single survivor in the otherwise desert place to which Peregrini go?
It's a good thought. The question is, in a sense, creating the plausible motif by where the tale survives, which of course, is a motif of literature very widely. Of course, I mean, the sort of tales we're talking about here, I think, are mostly actually earlier than, say, the Laugavola or those sorts of stories. So, which is which in a way, I suppose. But I guess the thing that's always struck me as interesting, though, is that we have a real event went on in the Faroe Islands. But as I think you rightly say, there's no reason to believe that the one survivor motif is anything to do with Dick Will. I mean, there might have been lots of survivors, in fact. The fact that one person remains behind could be a wholly different idea. It did interest me that in the Voyages of Brendan, the character that survives is a man who has giant sheep, and they grow giant because nobody takes their milk, which I think is a pointer to 1 Corinthians and the idea of Paul says, who would keep a flock but not take of its, milk. So the idea, in a sense, that maybe there's a sort of symbolism here also, that the man who is left behind is, in some ways, not really any longer of this world. He's now a person with a more symbolic role. But I think, yes, I mean, your point is quite right. It's quite a common motif across the board. And that could be all it is. But the idea that goes with this of the marauders, the animals that grow big, the cat that grows big, the sheep that goes big, it's clearly a very sustained motif. So there's a bit more to it than just someone there to tell the tale, I guess. But that's clearly what it also is. Yeah.
That reminds me of is the in Solinus of the kind of overgrazing cattle that are going to kind of burst because of the fertile Ireland is so fertile. It's obviously a kind of topos of abundance or maybe fertility. But yeah, it's interesting.
Because you're living close to paradise, maybe, and also the man who feeds the monks in the Voyages of Brendan brings them food, maybe there's an image of plenitude. Yeah. I think it's a very rich motif and a lot to it, but it plays out in different ways. I think Maureen's right to point out that there is, in the wider context, and one thinks here of the version in the life of St Brendan, there are synergies with other ways in which that motif is used. These are complicated stories. I mean, the way they pick up a number of different ideas. That one, a full exegesis of that motif would be worth doing, actually, I must say.
And just 2 more questions. One from Anthony Candon, just in terms of the pharaohs regarding settlement. Is the implication that they were the first to occupy these places? If there were sheep, were they brought by the peregrini, or can we read their existence as indicating prior human settlement?
That's a question that's been asked, again and again. I mean, how old are the sheep? And if the sheep are left behind, are they the sheep that the Irish brought there? One of the interesting things, as Tony may well know, that there's been studies of the paleoarchaeological studies have looked at this question of how old are, in fact, the remains on the island, and indeed how old potentially are the sheep. And there are suggestions purely from archaeology that there is settlement prior to what would be the Irish horizon if we go on the dates in Dick Will. But the problem with the dating in these places, often it's radiocarbon dating without much calibration, because you're way out in the ocean away from any of the tree ring sequences we have in Ireland and that sort of thing. So how early some of these dates really are, or how much margin for error there is a big problem. But yeah, it always remains an interesting question, and potentially one possibly solvable by genetics. Where do the sheep come from? They might come from somewhere completely different. I guess I do, however, think, well, yeah, did Irish monks turn up? They would have known if someone had built a field drain. Would they have known that sheep are not indigenous to the Faroe Islands? It depends on what their assumptions were. So when they say the islands were never occupied before, what are they basing it on? I guess is the question. I can see there were no burials or that sort of thing.
I remember I did field work with Barbara Crawford and Beverly Ballan-Smith on Papastour a long time ago, but there was an issue there with soil samples, and that actually the Peregrini were quite good at finding very fertile, or like the best spots on the island. I should also mention the Papar project website is worth checking out, developed by Barbara Crawford. I think that's still online, so that's would be worth checking. just a final question from Bernice Lam, Senecal. Does Dalan Forgald's Elegy for Columba tell us much about Columba's motivation for Peregrinatio?
I honestly can't say that my mind runs to enough detail on that at the moment. I mean, some of the material outside the life of Columba does quite specifically comment on Peregrinatio. One thinks, for example, of the poems of Begawan of Run, which talk about Columba sacrificing his body on the grey waves and these other imageries of Peregrinatio. But I can't say in the case of Dalan Forgald. I could pull up an image, but if you look, certainly a look through the collections of Columban poetic material, ably assembled, of course, by Thomas Clancy and Gilbert Marcus in their excellent volume, gives you many motifs of Peregrinatio, yes. And I think one of the things, that's overdue is for someone to go back and say, yeah, let's have a good study of the dossier just of Columba as a peregrinus, which, on another occasion I might have done tonight, but I got distracted by some other things I've been working on. So that's another topic for another day, I guess.
So just thank you again, Jonathan, for a very stimulating and rich presentation. And just to say that thank you all for joining this evening. We're taking a break for the summer, but the next lecture will be on it'll be on the, just get out the details, the 8th of September at 7:30, same time. And you can register for the webinar on the Loyola Institute website or on columcille.net in the event section. And you need to register for each lecture in the series. And our next speaker will be Meredith Coutrer, Michael Biggs Scholar and doctoral candidate in history at Worcester College, Oxford University. And her talk will actually fit in very nicely with yours, Jonathan. She's going to be talking on St Columba and the Fathers, which will look at the enduring interest in the Columban communities in the Egyptian Desert Fathers, St. Anthony of Egypt and St. Paul of Thebes. So it's going to combine very well together. So thank you again for joining us this evening, and have a nice summer. Slán August Bannacht.